The Uses of Enchantment, the Meaning and Importance of Fairy Tales by Bruno Bettelheim. From Part 1, A Pocket Full of Magic. Edible Conflicts and Resolutions. The Knight in Shining Armor and the Damsel in Distress. In the throes of edible conflict, a young boy resents his father for standing in his way of receiving Mother's exclusive attention. The boy wants Mother to admire him as the greatest hero of all. That means that somehow he must get Father out of the way. This idea, however, creates anxiety in the child, because without Father to protect and take care of them, what would happen to the family? And what if Father were to find out that the little boy wanted him out of the way? Might he not take a most terrible revenge? One can tell a small boy many times that someday he will grow up, marry, and be like his father without avail. Such realistic advice provides no relief from the pressures the child feels right now. But the fairy tale tells the child how he can live with his conflicts. It suggests fantasies he could never invent for himself. The fairy tale, for example, offers the story of the unnoticed little boy who goes out into the world and makes a great success of life. Details may differ, but the basic plot is always the same. The unlikely hero proves himself through slaying dragons, solving riddles, and living by his wits and goodness until eventually he frees the beautiful princess, marries her, and lives happily ever after. No little boy has ever failed to see himself in his starring role. The story implies it's not Father whose jealousy prevents you from having Mother all to yourself, it's an evil dragon. What you really have in mind is to slay an evil dragon. Further, the story gives veracity to the boy's feeling that the most desirable female is kept in captivity by an evil figure, while implying that it is not Mother the child wants for himself, but a marvelous and wonderful woman he hasn't met yet, but certainly will. The story tells more of what the boy wants to hear and believe, that it is not of her own free will that this wonderful female, i.e. Mother, abides with this bad male figure. On the contrary, if only she could, she would much prefer to be with the young hero, like the child. The dragon slayer always has to be young, like the child, and innocent. The innocence of the hero with whom the child identifies proves by proxy the child's innocence, so that, far from having to feel guilty about these fantasies, the child can feel himself to be the proud hero. It is characteristic of such stories that once the dragon is slain, or whatever deed that frees the beautiful princess from her captivity is accomplished, and the hero is united with his beloved, we are given no details about their life beyond being told that they lived happily ever after. If their children are mentioned, it's usually a later interpolation by someone who thought the story would become more enjoyable or realistic if such information were offered. But introducing children into the story's ending shows little comprehension of a small boy's imaginings about a blissful existence. A child cannot and does not want to imagine what is actually involved in being a husband and father. This would imply, for example, that he would have to leave Mother for most of the day to work, while the Oedipal fantasy is a situation where the boy and Mother will never be separated for a moment. The little boy certainly doesn't want Mother to be busy with housekeeping or taking care of other children. He doesn't want to have sex with her either, because that is still an area full of conflict for him, if he has much awareness of it at all. As in most fairy tales, the little boy's ideal is just he and his princess, Mother, all their needs and wishes taken care of, living by themselves and for each other forever. The edible problems of a girl are different from those of a boy, and so the fairy stories which help her to cope with her Oedipal situation are of a different character. What blocks the Oedipal girl's uninterrupted blissful existence with Father is an older, ill-intentioned female, i.e. Mother. But since the little girl also wants very much to continue enjoying Mother's loving care, there is also a benevolent female in the past or background of the fairy tale whose happy memory is kept intact, although she has become inoperative. A little girl wishes to see herself as a young and beautiful maiden, a princess or the like, who is kept captive by a selfish, evil female figure and hence unavailable to the male lover. The captive princess's real father is depicted as benevolent but helpless to come to the rescue of his lovely girl. In Rapunzel, it is a vow that stymies him. In Cinderella and Snow White, he seems unable to hold his own against the all-powerful stepmother. The Oedipal boy, who feels threatened by his father because of the wish to replace him in Mother's attention, casts Father in the role of the threatening monster. This also seems to prove to the boy how dangerous a rival to the father he is, because otherwise, why would this father figure be so threatening? Since the desirable female is held captive by the old dragon, the little boy can believe that only brute force prevents this lovely girl mother from joining him, the much preferred young hero. In fairy stories which help the Oedipal girl to understand her feelings and find vicarious satisfaction, it is the stepmother's or the enchantress' intense jealousy which keeps the lover from finding the princess. This jealousy proves that the older woman knows the young girl is preferable, more lovable, and more deserving of being loved. While the Oedipal boy does not want any children to interfere with mother's complete involvement in him, matters are different for the Oedipal girl. She does want to give her father the love gift of being mother to his children. Whether this is an expression of her need to compete with mother in this respect or a dim anticipation of her motherhood to come, it is difficult to determine. This desire to give father a child doesn't mean having sexual relations with him. The little girl, like the little boy, doesn't think in such concrete terms. The little girl knows that children are what bind the male even more strongly to the female. That is why in fairy stories dealing in symbolic form with Oedipal wishes, problems, and hardships of a girl, children are occasionally mentioned as part of the happy ending. In the Brothers Grimm's version of Rapunzel, we are told that the prince in his wanderings at length came to the desert where Rapunzel with the twins to which she had given birth, a boy and a girl, lived in wretchedness, though no children had been mentioned before. When she embraces the prince, 2 of Rapunzel's tears wet his eyes, which had been pierced and blinded, and cure his blindness, and he led her to his kingdom where he was joyfully received, and where they lived happily for a long time. Once they are united, no more is said about the children. They are only a symbol in the story of the bond between Rapunzel and the prince during their separation. Since we are not told of the 2 having been married and there is no other suggestion of any form of sexual relation, this mention of children in fairy tales supports the idea that children can be gotten without sex, just as a result of love. In the usual course of family life, the father is often out of the home, while the mother, having given birth to the children and nursed him, continues to be heavily involved in all child care. As a result, a boy can easily pretend that father is not all that important in his life. A girl cannot as readily imagine dispensing with mother's care, however. That is why a replacement of an original good father by a bad stepfather is as rare in fairy tales as an evil stepmother is frequent. Since fathers have typically given much less attention to the child, it is not such a radical disappointment when this father begins to stand in the child's way or to make demands of him. So the father who blocks the boy's Oedipal desires is not seen as an evil figure within the home or split into 2 figures, one good and one bad, as the mother often is. Instead, the Oedipal boy projects his frustrations and anxieties onto a giant monster or dragon. In a girl's Oedipal fantasy, the mother is split into 2 figures, the pre-Oedipal wonderful good mother and the Oedipal evil stepmother. Sometimes there are bad stepmothers in fairy stories with boys, such as in Hansel and Gretel, but such tales deal with problems other than Oedipal ones. The good mother, so the fantasy goes, would never have been jealous of her daughter or have prevented the prince, father, and the girl from living happily together. So, for the Oedipal girl, belief and trust in the goodness of pre-Oedipal mother and deep loyalty to her tend to reduce the guilt about what the girl wishes would happen to the stepmother who stands in her way. Thus, both Oedipal girls and boys, thanks to the fairy tale, can have the best of 2 worlds. They can fully enjoy Oedipal satisfactions in fantasy and keep good relations to both parents in reality. For the Oedipal boy, if mother disappoints him, there is a fairy princess in the back of his mind, that wonderful woman of the future who will compensate for all his present hardships, and the thought of whom makes it easier to bear up under them. If father is less attentive to his little girl than she desires, she can endure such adversity because a prince will arrive who will prefer her to all competitors. Since everything takes place in Never Never Land, the child need not feel guilty or anxious about casting father in the role of a dragon or evil giant, or mother in the role of a miserable stepmother or witch. The little girl can love her real father all the better because her resentment over his failure to prefer her to her mother is explained by his unfortunate ineffectuality, as with fathers in fairy tales, for which nobody can blame him since it is due to superior powers. Besides, it will never prevent her from getting her prince. A girl can love her mother more because she puts out all her anger at the mother competitor, who gets what she deserves, as Snow White's stepmother is forced to put on red-hot shoes and dance until she dropped dead. And Snow White, and with her little girl, need not feel guilty because her love of her true mother, who preceded the stepmother, has never stopped. The boy can love his real father even better after having gotten out all his anger at him through a fantasy of destroying the dragon or the bad giant. Such fairy tale fantasies, which most children would have a hard time inventing so completely and satisfactorily on their own, can help a child a great deal to overcome his Oedipal anguish. The fairy story has other unequaled values in helping the child with Oedipal conflicts. Mother cannot accept their little boy's wishes to do away with daddy and marry mommy, but a mother can participate with pleasure in her son's imagining himself as the dragon slayer who gains the possession of the beautiful princess. Also, a mother can fully encourage her daughter's fantasies about the handsome prince who will join her, thus helping her to believe in a happy solution despite her present disappointment. Thus, far from losing mother because of the Oedipal attachment to father, the daughter realizes that mother not only approves of such wishes in disguise, but even hopes for their realization. Through fairy tales, the parent can join the child in voyages of fancy, while still retaining the all-important function of fulfilling the parental tasks in reality. Thus, a child can have the best of both worlds, which is what he needs to grow up into a secure adult. In fantasy, a girl can win out over the stepmother whose efforts to prevent her happiness with the prince fail. A boy can slay the monster and gain what he wishes in a far distant land. At the same time, both girls and boys can retain a home, the real father as protector, and the real mother who dispenses all the care and satisfaction a child needs. Since it is clear all along that slaying the dragon and marrying the enslaved princess, or being discovered by the fairy prince and punishing the wicked witch, occur in faraway times and countries, the normal child never mixes them up with reality. Oedipal conflict stories are typical of a large class of fairy tales that extend the child's interests outside the immediate family. To make his first steps toward becoming a mature individual, the child must begin to look to the larger world. If the child does not receive support from his parents in his real and imaginary investigation of the world outside his home, it is at the risk of impoverishing the development of his personality. It is not wise to urge a child in so many words to begin to enlarge his horizons, or to inform him specifically how far to go in his explorations of the world, or how to sort out his feelings about his parents. If a parent verbally encourages a child to mature, to move out psychologically or geographically, the child interprets this as meaning they want to get rid of me. The result is the direct opposite of what is intended. For the child then feels unwanted and unimportant, and such feelings are most detrimental to the development of his ability to cope with this wider world. The child's learning task is precisely that of making decisions about moving out on his own, in his own good time, and into the areas of living he himself selects. The fairy tale helps in this process because it only beckons, it never suggests, demands, or tells. In the fairy tale, all is said implicitly and in symbolic form what the tasks for one's age might be, how one might deal with one's ambivalent feelings about one's parents, how this welter of emotions can be mastered. It also warns the child of some of the pitfalls he can expect and perhaps avoid, always promising a favorable outcome.